They buried the child in velvet, not because she was royalty, but to hide the shape of her skull. That's how the servants whispered it. But the truth was worse. Her head was elongated, misshapen, her eyes too far apart. She couldn't walk properly. Couldn't speak without stuttering. Her mind fogged, her joints stiff, her spine curved like a dying tree. But it wasn't a disease. It wasn't a curse from the gods. It was math. Cold, calculated genetics. She was the daughter of a brother and his sister. And she was not the first. Nor the last. You were never supposed to hear this. They kept it quiet behind palace walls and golden portraits. They painted the deformities away. Smiled for the history books. But beneath the silk and ceremony was a horror most people couldn't even imagine, generations of girls born broken. Not from war. Not from famine. But from bloodlines too obsessed with their own power to let them breathe. This isn't a story about royalty. This is a story about captivity. About flesh used as a vault to protect the gold of empires. You think you understand power. But real power doesn't care about children dying in silence. Real power would rather marry its niece than give up the throne. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the parts of history that were torn out of the textbooks. A descent into the most grotesque kind of loyalty, loyalty to the bloodline above life itself. We'll travel from the halls of Vienna to the dungeons of Castile, where empresses were locked away for thinking too much. We'll see how madness was manufactured, how beauty was broken, and how little girls were raised to marry their uncles, and die giving birth to sons who would repeat the cycle. But as you hear these names, Maria Anna, Joanna, Margaret Theresa, don't just think of them as queens or footnotes. Think of what it means when a civilization is built on blood without love. When your lineage becomes your prison. If you're still here, brace yourself. Because once you see what they did to keep their bloodlines pure, you won't be able to unsee it, the portraits lie. They always have. You've seen them, majestic paintings of royal daughters in glowing gowns, faces powdered pale, postures straight as columns. But those portraits were propaganda. A disguise. Because the real girls behind the oil and canvas were not angels of empire, they were casualties of a genetic trap so deep and ancient it rewired their bones. Take Maria Anna of Austria. To the world, she was a Habsburg archduchess. But her life, if you can call it that, was nothing more than a clinical experiment in dynastic failure. She was the child of uncle and niece. Her family tree looped like a noose. The same jaw. The same hunched back. The same brittle organs. By the time she was 10, her spine bent forward like a hook. Her jaw jutted so far she couldn't bite an apple. Breathing became labor. Speaking, a chore. Laughing? Unimaginable. But do you know what they called her? A miracle. Because she lived past infancy. Not because she thrived. Not because she was loved. But because in a palace where most inbred daughters died before age 5, Maria Anna's slow deterioration was seen as fortunate. Do you understand how warped that is? When your survival is celebrated not for joy, but because your corpse wasn't needed yet? Behind the velvet curtains of the Hofburg Palace, the servants whispered of the curse. But this wasn't mystical. It was medical. Generation after generation of cousin marriages compounded recessive genes like a recipe for ruin. They thought they were preserving royal blood. But what they were really preserving was mutation. Maria Anna was never allowed to leave the palace grounds. They said it was for her safety. But really, it was so the world wouldn't see what royalty actually looked like when its secrets weren't airbrushed with paint and perfume. She was hidden in shadowed rooms, away from sunlight, away from mirrors. And yet she knew. Because the truth always finds a way through the cracks. She saw the old family portraits. She traced the same disfigured features across the generations. And in a moment of terrifying clarity, she understood, she wasn't born broken. She was made broken. By people who were never punished. By choices made centuries before she was born. And so the mask of empire begins to crack. Are you starting to see it yet? Now listen carefully. Because this next one was never supposed to be remembered. She was erased. Buried not just under stone, but under shame. They called her Joanna the Mad. But madness, in her case, was a language no one wanted to understand. And yet, her story may be the most terrifying of all. Joanna of Castile was born in 1479. A princess of Spain. A daughter of two rulers who thought themselves chosen by God, Isabella and Ferdinand. The same rulers who launched Columbus, who expelled Jews and Muslims, who painted their bloodline as divine. But in their obsession with pure lineage, they passed down something else, a curse of the mind. Joanna's childhood was marked by silence. She was sharp. Quiet. Too observant. She read too much. She questioned too deeply. But her greatest sin? She felt too much. They married her off to Philip the Handsome, a man as cold as marble and twice as cruel. He slept with servants. He mocked her devotion. He disappeared for weeks. And Joanna? She clung to him like a drowning woman clings to a corpse. They called it madness. But in truth, it was emotional starvation. Trauma layered on trauma. And behind it, quietly growing in her blood, the same hereditary instability that had haunted her ancestors. Then Philip died. And Joanna snapped. She refused to bury him. Traveled with his rotting body across Spain. Opened the coffin at night. Kissed the decaying lips. Slept beside him in freezing halls, candle burning, eyes wide open. People gasped. Historians scoffed. But what if she wasn't mad? What if she had simply seen too much? Too much betrayal. Too much isolation. Too much systemic rot disguised as duty. What if her insanity was actually a mirror, reflecting the insanity of the empire that raised her? Her father and son locked her in a convent for 46 years. No trial. No proof. Just whispers. Just power. She died there, toothless, barefoot, forgotten. But here's what you were never told, Joanna's bloodline is the same one that ruled over half the world. Her genetic fragility? Passed down to rulers, kings, and emperors. And yet no one dared question the system that produced her, because doing so would mean admitting that empire itself was sick. So I'll ask you now. How many mad women were simply too awake for the world they were born into? And how many more were buried before we ever knew their names? The deeper you go, the more you see the pattern. Every girl in this web was born with a crown over her cradle, and a chain around her neck. Margaret Theresa of Spain was no different. When you look at her portraits by Diego Velázquez, you might see a small, doll-like girl in ornate dresses, her hair arranged like golden halos. But if you know what to look for, you'll see the truth Velázquez could never say out loud. The slight bulge in her jaw. The tension in her shoulders. The distance in her gaze. Margaret was born in 1651, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain, and his niece. Her marriage was arranged before she could walk. Her husband-to-be? Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and her own uncle. This wasn't scandal. This was policy. Margaret was a commodity, bred, traded, and shipped like a rare artifact. Her body was a vault for the continuation of a dynasty already crumbling under the weight of its own purity. At 15, she was shipped to Vienna, away from the only home she had ever known. Her wedding was a spectacle, the kind of display meant to distract the world from the sickness hiding behind silk and gold. But marriage was not a fairy tale, it was an assignment. And the assignment was brutal. Margaret was pressured to bear children immediately, despite her fragile health and underdeveloped body. Pregnancy after pregnancy wore her down. She suffered miscarriages, stillbirths. And when a child did survive, it often inherited the same slow-burn curse: weak lungs, curved spine, fragile bones. By the time Margaret Theresa was 21, her body was failing. Her organs strained. Her joints burned. Her breathing grew labored. And yet, the demand never stopped: produce heirs. Continue the bloodline. Obey the plan. She died at 21. And here's the part that should make your stomach turn: her death wasn't treated as tragedy. It was treated as inconvenience. A failed investment. Within months, her widowed husband, her uncle, married her niece. Do you understand the level of obsession it takes to cycle your own family like livestock? This wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about control. Absolute, generational control. And once you see it here, you start to recognize it everywhere. Because when the goal is power at any cost, human life is never the cost they count. By now, you've probably noticed something. These women weren't just victims of bad genetics. They were victims of a system designed to recycle its own decay. The same names, the same blood, the same diseases, passed down like heirlooms. And no family embodied this decay more than the Habsburgs. For centuries, their motto could have been carved in bone: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did, into themselves. Cousins to cousins. Uncles to nieces. Aunts to nephews. It was an unbroken circle of faces growing more and more alike, and more deformed. The infamous Habsburg jaw wasn't a myth. It was a deformity so severe that some couldn't fully close their mouths. Chewing was labor. Breathing was strained. Speaking required effort. Yet portraits painted them as divine beings, symbols of God's order. The truth? They were symbols of something else entirely. Think about it: if you can control the throne, you control the land. If you control the land, you control the people. And if you keep the bloodline pure, you never lose that control to outsiders. The catch? You also never let in fresh strength. No new resilience. No genetic repair. Over time, their bodies began to fold inward: narrow chests, weak hearts, brittle bones. Their minds, too, were clouded. Records show depression, paranoia, bursts of irrational rage. And yet they doubled down. The very proof of their decay became a badge of pride. Why? Because to them, the family was the empire. And an empire's survival mattered more than the survival of the people inside it. Here's the part most will never admit: this wasn't just arrogance. It was strategy. A brutal, cold strategy. By marrying within, they kept outsiders from gaining influence, ensured loyalty could be traced by blood, and maintained a dynasty that could not be challenged without literally spilling the family's veins. But every strategy has a breaking point. And by the 17th century, the Habsburgs were reaching theirs. The physical weaknesses were too visible to hide. The mental instability too costly to ignore. But the system was too entrenched to change. The next generation was already doomed before they were born. And here's where you, watching this, need to stop for a moment. If you've followed me this far, type this in the comments twice: blood without love is poison. Because once you see this pattern, you'll start to recognize the same sickness, different names, different faces, still alive in our world today. The sickness didn't stay in palaces. What began as a royal obsession with pure bloodline seeped into the foundations of entire nations. It shaped laws, alliances, wars. It determined who could marry whom, who could inherit land, who was considered worthy of power. And the dangerous part? Once people believe that purity equals strength, they will justify any cruelty to protect it. The royals simply had the wealth to hide the consequences. Behind the marble walls and painted ceilings, children were born half-formed, with spines twisted like ropes, lungs that never filled, eyes that couldn't focus. Many didn't survive long enough for a portrait. Those who did were trained from birth to hide the tremors in their hands, to speak slowly so their stuttering wouldn't show, to smile with closed lips so no one could see the jaw. Imagine the psychological prison of that upbringing, knowing your body is failing you, but you must still perform perfection for the world. You must still be the ideal. And it wasn't just physical pain. There was the isolation. Girls were raised in rooms so silent that the ticking of the clock became a companion. They were allowed no real friendships. Every person they spoke to was another potential spy, another mouth that could whisper about their weakness. Marriages were not celebrations, they were assignments. Sentences. You could be 15, trembling, barely able to breathe without effort, and still be placed in a bed next to a man twice your age, who was also your uncle, because the family required an heir. The result? A cycle not only of physical collapse but of emotional collapse. Loneliness became hereditary. Despair, a family tradition. And the worst part is, they believed they were sacrificing themselves for the greater good. That's the psychological control of systems like this. They teach you that your suffering is noble, even necessary. That your broken body is a sign of loyalty. That your death is just a cost of keeping the bloodline pure. And once you've accepted that, they don't need to lock you in a room anymore. You'll lock yourself in. Because what's more powerful than physical captivity? Belief. Belief that dying for the family is better than living for yourself. And in that belief, entire empires rotted from the inside out. By now you've seen the fractures, bones snapping beneath crowns, minds unraveling in silk-draped prisons. But to truly understand the horror, you need to see how deep the rot went. Because the curse of keeping bloodlines pure didn't just destroy the body, it corrupted the very idea of love. In these dynasties, love wasn't an emotion. It was a transaction. Every relationship was weighed against political maps, treaties, and inheritance charts. Children weren't born because two people chose each other, they were born because two empires needed each other. Picture a young girl, let's say she's 12, standing in front of a mirror taller than she is. A maid adjusts her gown while a chamberlain recites the names of her future husband's titles. She's never met him. He's 27. He's her cousin. In the mirror, she tries to imagine his face. But the truth is, she already knows it. She's seen it at every family feast, painted on every wall. The same jawline. The same eyes. The same blood that will eventually kill her. And she will say yes. Because she has no other word to say. You see, that's the hidden machinery of this system, obedience engineered over generations. These girls were raised to believe that rejecting the arrangement wasn't just rebellion, it was treason against God. Against their ancestors. Against the very meaning of their existence. And so, they learned to wear the cage like jewelry. The palaces were full of them, women with hollow eyes, smiling at banquets while their insides collapsed. Their bodies might last 20 years, 30 if they were lucky. Few reached 40. Many died in childbirth, their final act in service to the dynasty. The chronic illnesses were so common that palace physicians kept entire journals filled with measurements, how far the jaw protruded, how bent the spine had become, how weak the pulse. But those journals were never meant to cure anyone. They were records of maintenance. Logs for the next generation of breeders. And that's when you realize the most terrifying truth, they didn't want to fix the curse. Because the curse was the system. The bloodline didn't just carry their power, it defined it. Even if it killed them, they believed it was better to die pure than to live with the blood of outsiders. And that belief is what made the inbreeding not just a mistake, but a deliberate act of empire. But power built on decay can only stand for so long. By the late 17th century, the cracks were no longer whispers behind palace doors, they were visible in broad daylight. Portraits couldn't hide the deformities anymore. Courtiers could not ignore the coughing fits, the fainting spells, the children who never made it past their first birthday. The Habsburgs, once the most dominant dynasty in Europe, were now a living warning sign. The last of their Spanish line, Charles II, embodied the full weight of centuries of genetic collapse. His jaw jutted so far he couldn't chew properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth. He struggled to walk. He struggled to speak. And yet, they crowned him king. Why? Because there was no one else left. By then, the family tree wasn't a tree at all, it was a circle. Every branch led back into itself. Charles II's parents were uncle and niece, just as theirs had been. He was the inevitable product of hundreds of years of breeding, not for strength, but for control. The result was a king who could barely rule his own body, let alone an empire. He suffered seizures, chronic infections, and something worse, he was sterile. The one duty drilled into him from birth, the sole reason for his existence, was impossible. The line was doomed. And still, they tried. They arranged marriages, desperate unions with women from acceptable families, hoping for a miracle. Each attempt ended the same: no child, no heir. Behind closed doors, the court's fear grew into superstition. They whispered that Charles was cursed by witches, that his blood was poisoned by sin. But it wasn't witchcraft. It was arithmetic. A genetic equation that had finally reached its conclusion. In 1700, Charles II died childless. And with him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty died too. Think about that. Centuries of war, wealth, alliances, ended not by an enemy's sword, but by the dynasty's own choices. They believed purity would make them untouchable. Instead, it hollowed them out from within, until there was nothing left to pass on. It is the perfect irony of power: the same walls you build to keep the world out, become the walls that keep life itself from getting in. And history is littered with the bones of rulers who learned that too late. When the Habsburg line in Spain collapsed, it didn't vanish quietly, it ignited one of the bloodiest wars Europe had ever seen. The War of the Spanish Succession wasn't just about who would wear the crown, it was about the balance of power across an entire continent. France, England, Austria, and countless smaller states all plunged into the chaos. But here's the bitter truth: none of this had to happen. It was the inevitable chain reaction of a dynasty that refused to let in fresh blood. For centuries, the Habsburgs had locked their gates, convinced that outsiders would taint their legacy. Instead, it was their obsession with purity that ensured their extinction. Even in defeat, their story did not serve as a warning, it became a blueprint. Other royal houses watched, not with horror, but with envy, for how long the Habsburgs had kept power bottled inside their own circle. And so the cycle repeated itself in other nations, in other palaces, behind other gilded doors. In France, the Bourbon dynasty began threading similar lines of consanguinity. In Russia, the Romanovs dabbled in dangerous genetic repetition. The lesson was never learned because the real problem was never admitted. These families weren't just protecting their bloodlines. They were protecting their control, their monopoly on the crown, the land, and the very idea of legitimacy. And the world beyond the palace? It kept turning. New sciences emerged. The understanding of heredity grew sharper. By the 19th century, doctors and biologists were openly discussing the dangers of inbreeding, not as superstition, but as fact. Yet inside royal walls, science didn't matter. What mattered was name. And so, generation after generation, more monarchs carried silent genetic time bombs: weak hearts, brittle bones, bleeding disorders. These flaws weren't bad luck. They were the accumulated debts of centuries of selfish breeding. Even now, fragments of these bloodlines remain. You can see them in the portraits hanging in European palaces: the high foreheads, the pale, drawn faces, the unsettling resemblance between rulers born decades apart. Some historians argue that even in the modern age, certain aristocratic circles still cling to the same quiet principles: keep the wealth in the family, no matter the cost. The Habsburgs may be gone, but their shadow is long. It lingers in every institution that values the preservation of power over the preservation of life. And if you think this kind of thinking died with powdered wigs and candlelit courts, you might want to look a little closer at the families who still own the world today. There's a truth most history books will never print: the fall of the Habsburgs wasn't just the end of a dynasty, it was a quiet victory for the idea that no family, no matter how rich or royal, is immune to the laws of nature. But even as their palaces emptied and their titles faded, the blueprint they left behind didn't disappear. Power doesn't surrender. It adapts. Today, it no longer wears crowns or embroidered robes. It wears tailored suits, signs international trade deals, and sits at the head of global corporations. The principle is the same: control resources, keep influence within a closed circle, and if necessary, sacrifice individuals for the survival of the group. Look closely at the last 2 centuries. You'll see echoes of the Habsburg strategy in boardrooms, political dynasties, and even media empires. Family names still dominate positions of power. Wealth still passes quietly through generations, shielded by trusts, foundations, and shell companies. The marriages may now be mergers and acquisitions, but the effect is identical: consolidation of influence, preservation of the bloodline's reach. And just like the Habsburgs, these modern dynasties understand one thing very well: secrecy is survival. While the public is distracted by celebrity scandals and political theater, the true architects of influence keep their movements in the shadows. The public gets the show, the real deals happen in whispers. But here's the part no one tells you: the same arrogance that destroyed the Habsburgs still exists today. The belief that you can lock power in a vault and keep it there forever, that the rules of the game don't apply to you. In the 17th century, it showed up in twisted jawlines and fragile airs. In the 21st century, it shows up as political collapse, financial implosions, and legacies turned into cautionary tales. The Habsburg curse wasn't just genetic, it was psychological. It was the fatal blindness of believing that control was worth more than adaptability. That obsession with preservation is the seed of self-destruction. And if history has taught us anything, it's this: the walls they build to keep power in are the same walls that eventually close in on them. So the real question is, when the next great bloodline falls, will it happen in the pages of history, or will you be alive to watch it collapse in real time?